According to the author of this article, Dr. Jones, I think, yeah, she's MD PhD. She's African American. I think she was on faculty at Harvard or something. She was, she is prominent in this field in the areas of race, ethnicity, and health. And according to her, Dr. Jones, there are 3 levels of racism: institutional racism, personally mediated racism, and internalized racism. So, when we talk about institutionalized racism, it means racism, the act of racism, embedded in the structure of major institutions like economic institutions, corporations, factories, business, education system, healthcare system, other social institutions, and the government or political institutions. Institutionalized racism are sometimes legalized. Because they are sometimes legalized, they are embedded in the fabric of the major social institutions. Sometimes institutionalized racism is manifested in job creation, in hiring processes, promotion, raises, and other things that take place in the economic institution. Institutionalized racism is also manifested in the economic and political institutions in terms of who qualify for loans and where can they live, based on where they can afford to buy a house or what kind of loan they can get, is jointly determined by the government and banks, corporations, other lending entities. The Jim Crow law is one example of institutionalized racism. Jim Crow law. In the 60s and prior, in the southern states, there are 2 water fountains for whites and non-whites. And non-whites cannot sit in front of the bus. These are all manifestations of institutionalized racism. Can you see that? The apartheid system in South Africa is another example of institutionalized racism. Because of the apartheid system in the 90s and before that, people of African descent, they could not enroll in certain programs in university. They had to live in certain neighborhoods because of residential segregation. The whites were more privileged in South Africa during apartheid. So, institutionalized racism are the practice of racism that's embedded in the major institutions of society or major structures of society. The major institutions in any society can be economic institutions, your corporations, your business, your banks. These are all economic institutions, or the political institutions, the government, different government agencies. These are your political institutions, or education institutions. affirmative action is one example of institutionalized racism in a positive way. Affirmative action programs. Many countries have affirmative action programs to rectify existing inequalities in different domains. I'm from Malaysia, and when we were governed by the British, because the British wanted to delay our independence, they let the major ethnic groups, which are the Malays, Chinese, and Indians, have our own language and culture. They did not encourage us to intermingle or have a common language. Because of the lack of a common language, all these major ethnic groups could not join force to fight for our independence. It took a while because there's no common language to communicate. We live our separate ways before independence. And the British encouraged Malays to be in agriculture, Indians to be in rubber plantations, Chinese to be in the mining industries and other commercial activities. Because the major ethnic groups, they had different livelihoods. They see or they saw only their own people under the bricks. And there's no common language. Only a few people could speak English, the common language among all ethnic groups, the highly educated folks, before independence. And because of that, the major ethnic groups in Malaysia could not join force to fight for our independence. And because different ethnic groups were encouraged to pursue different economic pursuits under colonization, some were more wealthier than others. Chinese were wealthier than Malays and Indians. And because of that, these disparities carried on after independence, to the point that there was a major riot because Malays who were in agriculture, they fell back. They had lower education and lower incomes. So they weren't happy after independence. There was a riot in the 60s, shortly after independence. And because of that, to prevent a second riot, our independent government instituted an affirmative action programs. They give preferential treatments to the Malays who were shortchanged by the British. Different educational requirement for college and university admissions. And companies have to have 30% of Malays employee to rectify the previous inequalities because of the British rule. This is an example of institutionalized racism in a positive direction. Can you see that? I think it also happens in South Africa in the 90s after Mandela won the election. He instituted several affirmative action policies. There are different quotas in companies to make things more equal between the blacks and the whites. And he revised the entrance requirements for college and university admissions to make things more equal. This is another example of institutionalized racism in a positive sense. Questions so far? And this also happens in Fiji. in other countries that had colonial rule. Even if institutionalized racism is not legalized, because people has been practicing certain things over the centuries, over the decades, maybe in their subconscious, semi-conscious, unconscious mind, they think my ancestors, my grandparents, my parents have been doing things this way, have been treating people from another racial group this way. I'm going to do the same. They never process further whether it's right or wrong to treat people from another racial group in a particular way. The practice is so ingrained within the culture of that society, even if it's not legalized. Their ancestors, parents, grandparents have been doing certain things certain ways for centuries. They do the same thing. It becomes a form of institutionalized racism. Can you see that? This is the first level of racism. Are we clear? You can read this on your own. Because of institutionalized racism, it gives rise to unequal access to economic opportunities and unequal power basis. Some are wealthier. Some have more power because of institutionalized racism. Can you see that? The second type of racism refers to personally mediated racism. According to personally mediated racism, it says that we have different assumptions about those from another racial group because of our pre-existing prejudice, stereotype, and discrimination. Can you see how personally mediated racism is different from institutionalized racism? Personally mediated racism focus on interaction among individuals in a society. One group of people have certain assumptions about another group of a different race, different ethnic groups, because of their pre-existing prejudice, stereotypes, and discrimination. And because of this pre-existing prejudice, stereotypes, and discrimination, we have certain assumptions about another racial group's motivations, intentions, abilities. Any questions so far? And internalized racism has something to do with self-fulfilling prophecy. When a racial group or somebody, just an individual from a racial group, internalize the stereotypes about that group, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy when the person acts out all these stereotypes. One example of internalized racism would be, initially, it seems that the blacks in the southern states, they did not really retaliate. They just went to sit at the back of the bus. They used a different fountains. These are manifestation of internalized racism. Can you see that? Question: